On October the 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a brutal attack on Israel, killing 1,300 civilians. The world swiftly condemned the assault and expressed solidarity with Israel. The EU did too. Well, sort of. The former Hungarian commissioner was the first to act, announcing a freeze on EU aid to Palestinians. The problem? He didn't consult his colleagues or member states. The European Commission quickly distanced itself from his statement, and as Gaza's humanitarian crisis deepened due to Israel's military response, the message shifted again. Aid wouldn't be frozen, it would be tripled. Meanwhile, Josep Borrell, the former EU's chief diplomat, took a different tone. He condemned Hamas but also criticized Israel for cutting off water, power, and fuel to Gaza, calling it a violation of international law. Then there was Ursula von der Leyen. She didn't just issue statements, she flew to Israel, offering what she called unreserved support on behalf of the European Union. No mention of restraint, no reference to international law, just firm backing. But the member states didn't agree. Some, like Spain, Ireland, and Belgium, voiced frustration, and von der Leyen consequently faced political backlash, as her stance was considered unbalanced, sometimes biased, and unrepresentative of the EU as a whole. And what about Charles Michel, the other EU president at the time? Yes, it's confusing. There are two of them. His job was to lead EU diplomacy, yet he wasn't invited, or even informed about von der Leyen's trip. Awkward. During the same period, the United States of America, a federation with one defense and foreign affairs policy, moved swiftly. 2 aircraft carriers were dispatched to the region, an unmistakable signal aimed at Iran and Hezbollah. Do not widen this conflict. President Joe Biden, alongside his secretaries of state and defense, made their way to Israel. The message was super clear. Solidarity with Israel? Absolutely. Do you see the problem here? The EU struggles to find a unified response to global conflicts. Agreeing on words is hard enough, but taking action? That's even harder. You see, there are 3 key issues here. First, there are the institutional rivalries within the EU. Just look at the players involved. The President of the Commission, the President of the European Council, and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Who's really in charge? The overlapping roles create confusion, competition, and mixed messaging. Second, deep-seated differences in sympathy and interests among EU member states. Take the Middle East, for example. For historical reasons, Germany, von der Leyen's home country, feels special responsibility to protect Israel. For reasons of geography and history, countries like France, Italy, and Spain tend to feel closer to Arab states and the Palestinians. Meanwhile, Central European countries, which joined the EU in the 2000s, align more instinctively with Israel and the United States. The third issue is the conflict between the EU's values and interests. While it promotes democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, it also prioritizes stability, economic interests, and controlling migration. These competing goals often undermine its ability to act decisively. But there's actually also a fourth issue, probably the biggest one yet. But to understand, let's turn to our next major case study, the war in Ukraine. Right after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the EU performed surprisingly well, at least by its historically low standards. Member states quickly united in condemning Russia's aggression, and the EU took a strong political stance alongside NATO from day one. With impressive preparation by the Commission, EU leaders agreed within days on a robust first package of economic sanctions. The EU even announced its first ever plan to fund weapons supplies to Kiev. But when you examine the effectiveness of the EU's foreign policy in this conflict, the conclusion is hard to avoid. It hasn't been enough. Russia has not been weakened to the point of forcing President Vladimir Putin to change course, nor has the EU provided Ukraine with the military and economic support needed to win. Without US leadership, its massive military aid, intelligence, and overall strategic support, Ukraine might well have been defeated by now, despite the EU's efforts. But seriously, let's pause for a moment to reflect on just how crazy this is. In 2022, Russia had a GDP of $2.3 trillion and a population of 143 million people. The EU, by comparison, had a GDP of almost $17 trillion and a population of 449 million people. Russia's entire economy is about the size of Italy's. Yet the EU wasn't able to use its might to steer the tide of the war. Simply put, powerhouse EU states like Germany and France did too little, too late. Now imagine if Russia invaded Canada, the United States' neighbor. Do you really think that this war would still be dragging on today? Instead of a proactive unified strategy, what we've seen is a reactive approach, helping just enough to prevent Ukraine from falling, but never enough to decisively turn the tide. And this brings us to the fourth key issue. The EU doesn't actually have much power or influence. Despite all its presidents and institutions, when it comes to foreign policy, real authority lies with the member states. Troop deployments and arms procurement, these decisions are firmly in national hands. Unlike the United States, which can mobilize aircraft carriers, send troops, or act unilaterally in response to a crisis, the EU remains dependent on national militaries. So what can the EU actually do? Well, there's the Common Foreign and Security Policy Framework, also called the CFSP. Quite a mouthful. But it basically allows member states to agree on collective responses to global issues, like sanctions, peacekeeping missions, or diplomatic statements. These positions are legally binding, which helps maintain a degree of consistency in the EU's external messaging. The CFSP is led by the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, who represents the EU internationally and coordinates diplomatic efforts. This role bridges the European Commission, which handles policy implementation, and the European Council, made up of 27 EU leaders, which provides strategic direction. But the CFSP has clear limitations, bringing us to the fifth and final issue with the EU's foreign policy. Decisions require unanimity among all 27 member states, a process that often slows action or stops it altogether. Just look at the struggle to pass sanctions against Russia, with Hungary repeatedly vetoing every move. In short, the EU's foreign policy framework exists, but it's only as strong as its weakest link. So these are the 5 key issues the EU faces when it comes to foreign policy. The question is, what can the EU actually do to fix these glaring problems? First, for God's sake, let's reform the EU's absurdly complex web of institutions. Did you know there are 7 of them? It's time to simplify and cut out duplication. Do we really need 2 presidents? I honestly don't think so. One president to represent the entire Union would go a long way toward fixing these issues. On top of that, the EU representative needs a clear mandate to coordinate EU foreign policy, development, and sanctions. So von der Leyen, back off a bit, or at least make sure we are all speaking with one voice. The hardest part, of course, will be securing a much greater commitment from member states to pool their interests and resources. Take Germany's Scholz calling Putin without consulting the EU. That kind of thing needs to become a relic of the past. Next, we need to remove the veto power of individual member states and switch to qualified majority voting, period. This step alone would address 2 key problems. First, the EU would become quicker, able to make decisions even if few member states disagree. Second, it would tackle the issue of diverse national interests by forcing countries to compromise, rather than allowing them to block the entire process. This would allow the EU to establish foreign policy values with mid to long-term goals, just like the US does. And this brings us to the most important and most difficult step, giving the EU the actual competence to act in foreign policy. Without this, the EU will never have a real voice on the global stage. That means creating a mandate for the EU to use military force when necessary, whether through an EU strike force or a coordinated mix of national militaries. The reality, however, is sobering. Can you imagine any French president referring to Brussels during a crisis in the Middle East or Africa? I can't. It's equally unthinkable that Paris would give up its permanent seat on the UN Security Council to the EU. And let's not kid ourselves. German chancellors are no more likely to abandon their own national line when it comes to relations with Russia or China. But here's the hard truth. Unless and until Paris and Berlin are willing to pool more of their foreign policy sovereignty, the EU's efforts to carry greater geopolitical weight will keep falling short. Without that step, the world's largest trading bloc will remain little more than a bystander and commentator, unable to defend its interests, let alone its values. A big thank you to the sponsor of this video, the Union of European Federalists, in short, UEF. If you like some of the ideas we've discussed, you might be interested in their vision of a European federation, where the EU has real foreign policy powers and a stronger voice in the world. Check out their details in the description below. If you want more, check out this video here about whether the EU should pursue nuclear deterrence, or this video here about how a European federation could look like. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share if you found this video interesting. And a huge shout out to our patrons, especially our presidents. Jan, Sjoukje, BJ, Peter, Kristen, and AGVD. Your support makes this all possible.